Jack Ketch has gone down in history as one of the worst executioners, and it was for the execution of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, that Ketch's reputation occurred. During the execution of the illegitimate son of Charles II, Ketch made a horrific mess of the job, to the outrage of the audience there that day on Tower Hill in London. However, who was the man who Jack Ketch savagely blundered? James Scott ultimately tried to raise a rebellion against his uncle King James II, and tried to depose him. However, ultimately this failed, and he was beheaded for treason. So join us today as we look at the brutal execution of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Born on the 9th of April 1649, James Scott was the son of Charles II and Lucy Walter. Charles the Prince of Wales was only 18, and Lucy Walter is considered his first mistress, and from this relationship James was born in the Netherlands. As an illegitimate son, he was unable to succeed to the Scottish and English throne, unless he could prove rumours that his parents had secretly married. He believed his parents were married, and claimed to have evidence that Charles and his mother were together, but the king later testified that he was only married to his queen, Catherine. The young James was kidnapped at one point by the king's men and sent to Paris. However, on the 14th of February 1663, aged 13, he was brought to England and was created the title the Duke of Monmouth, along with the titles the Earl of Doncaster and Baron Scott of Tynedale. He then in the following month became a Knight of the Garter. Before then, in April, days before his 14th birthday, he became married to Anne Scott. James did take his wife's surname, and together they became a Duke and Duchess. Now James Scott was a rather popular young man, and he was a well-known Protestant, and in a sharp rivalry the king's brother James was the Duke of York, and he was heir to James Scott's father's throne. This is due to James Scott's illegitimacy. Scott's uncle was openly Catholic, and this caused a bit of an issue. Aged 16, James Scott was part of the English fleet with his uncle during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and he then returned to be captain of a cavalry group. Then he rose through the ranks of the army and commanded 6,000 soldiers during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, and he then became Lord Lieutenant of the East Riding of Yorkshire and the Governor of Kingston upon Hull. He gained a reputation for being a brilliant soldier and commander, and he further gained important titles such as the Chancellor of Cambridge University and the Master of the Horse. King Charles II ordered that all military orders should be taken first to his illegitimate son to be checked, and with this James Scott became the main power behind the army, navy and armed forces. In 1676 he was acting as commander of the Dutch Army Brigade, fighting against the French, and he continued to develop his reputation as a feared soldier. When returning home, he also commanded an army that put down the Scottish Covenanter rebellion. As much as James Scott did for protecting England, the English public saw him as a rather popular figure. Following the Rye House Plot of 1683, which was an attempt to kill Charles and James, he was forced to go into exile in the Netherlands, and then he gathered supporters in The Hague. Now a rebellion was planned in Holland, and it was to work alongside a rebellion in Scotland, and several areas of England were plotted to have a rebellion in them, as they were seen as having lots of animosity for the monarchy. The target of Monmouth's rebellion was James II, his uncle. Now after Charles II died, his brother was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of April 1685, and he was openly a Catholic convert. Many across England were worried for their religion, and as Monmouth was Protestant they turned to him, and some believed that he should have been the legitimate heir to Charles II. Monmouth himself wished to become the king, and he believed he would seize the throne with the Protestant support of England. So a rebellion was to occur, and Monmouth sold many of his belongings to raise funds for weapons and ships, and he set sail for England on the 30th of May 1685. He was backed by 3 small ships, a set of field guns, 1,500 muskets, and he landed in a region of Dorset, and on the first day they gathered 300 men at Lyme Regis who supported Monmouth. The king had received reports of the impending plot, and he was told of Monmouth's arrival. Over the next few days volunteers arrived to support Monmouth, and he quickly had an army of around 1,000. They moved throughout Dorset raising more soldiers, and near to Bridport they encountered 1,200 royalist soldiers. Monmouth learned of more royalist soldiers and left, and he then decided to head north to Somerset rather than to go to London. More recruits joined his force, and his numbers swelled to around 6,000, and in different towns they denounced the king to raise more support. Monmouth declared himself as the rightful king in many different towns along the way, before a battle erupted at the Battle of Sedgemoor. The two armies met on the 6th of July 1685 in what was the last clear-cut pitched battle between two armies on English soil. Now Monmouth's force was made up of different soldiers and was rather disorganised, and they could not go up against a strong and organised royalist army. Monmouth's army was decimated, with up to 2,700 soldiers being killed, with only 27 royalist soldiers being killed themselves. Things were so bad that Monmouth fled from the battlefield, but 2 days later he was captured in a ditch. Quickly Parliament moved to pass an Act of Attainder, sentencing Monmouth to death as a traitor, but no trial was needed. James Monmouth begged for his life, saying he would even turn over to the Catholic religion to be spared, but no mercy was offered. It was said, James the Duke of Monmouth has in a hostile manner invaded the kingdom, and the said Duke of Monmouth be convicted and attainted of high treason, and that he suffer pain of death. He was held inside the Tower of London for a while before his execution date was prepared. Before his execution he told bishops he would die a true Protestant, and he then prepared for his death. On the morning of his execution he was dressed in clean stockings, a fresh skirt and a lace scarf, as well as a grey suit lined with black, and he wore a long periwig. His wife visited him that morning to bid him farewell, and he instructed his children to also be respectful to their mother and to be loyal to the king. James Scott was then taken out of the Tower's walls before embarking on the short walk to Tower Hill. The scaffold had been prepared for the Duke of Monmouth's execution, and because of the high-profile element of his execution, the scaffold was protected by scores of the king's guards. His scaffold had been draped in mourning cloth, and when he climbed up to the scaffold he noticed the absolutely huge crowd that had gathered around Tower Hill to see him die. On the scaffold was Jack Ketch, a man who has gone down in history as the worst executioner. Monmouth said to him when he got to the scaffold, "Do your work well," and whilst there Monmouth said very little. Many of the crowd wished to see Monmouth, their man, a hero, die. He then turned to Ketch again and said, "Here are 6 guineas for you. Pray do your business well. Do not serve me as you did my Lord Russell. I have heard you struck him 3 or 4 times. If you give me 2 strokes I promise I will not stir." So Jack Ketch had already got a reputation for being a blundering axeman, but what happened next was even worse. After this short discourse he removed his periwig and waistcoat, and refused to wear a blindfold, where he knelt at the block. After a moment he turned to Ketch and asked him if he could feel the axe. After this he claimed that he felt the axe was not sharp enough to strike his head from his body. Ketch then reassured him that it was, and it's here that possibly Ketch was unnerved. So the Duke of Monmouth was ready for his execution. Jack Ketch then swung his axe down onto James Scott's neck, but it caught the side of his neck, and Scott then looked up in shock. The second swing made a slightly bigger cut into his neck, and the third swing missed altogether. Ketch then allegedly threw down his axe, crying, "God damn me, I can do no more. My heart fails me, I cannot do it." At this point the crowd turned into an angry mob, and they threatened to kill Ketch if he could not do better. He was then forced to pick the axe back up, and it took a further 3 blows to kill Monmouth, but after 6 swings his head was still attached. Ketch then grabbed the butcher's knife and finally cut through the last sinews before James Scott's head fell onto the floor, and he was declared a traitor. The crowd was so appalled by his execution that Jack Ketch had to be led away under armed guard, as the crowd wanted his blood too. The body of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was then taken back to the Tower of London, and was to be buried inside the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower's walls. According to a legend, it was stated that the Duke of Monmouth's portrait had never been painted, and this was realised after his execution. The legend states how his body was then exhumed from the chapel's floor, and then his head was stitched back onto his body. It was then claimed that the body, which was now restored with its head, was sat for a portrait to be painted. One painting of Monmouth was painted showing a sleeping or dead Monmouth, which gave credence to this story, and 2 others were painted very close to his time of death. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth's execution was horrifically brutal and savage. Jack Ketch's performance was known as a disgrace, and the crowd that day wanted his blood, such was the outrage. James Scott is remembered today as a rebel who led an army against the King James II. However, he did believe he was the rightful King of England and legitimate. The rebellion he launched was wrapped up in religious turmoil that began during the Tudor period. However, he met his end in the same way that so many did during that time period, at the bloody end of the axe. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.